The Threll called my map a relic. Subcommander Weiss said it on the third morning, in that particular Threll tone, flat, a little clinical, like she was identifying a geological sample rather than expressing an opinion. She came into the secondary bay where I slept, picked my topographic map off my bunk while I was lacing my boots, unfolded one panel, held it at arm's length for a moment, and refolded it the way someone refolds something they have concluded is not what they were hoping it would be. Paper, she said. Yes. Topographic survey paper, pre-digital. A pause. Is this from a museum collection? I told her it was from a survey depot in Valin province. Printed 6 years ago on weatherproof stock, updated from the satellite survey archive. Completely standard kit for a field assignment above 3,000 meters. She looked at me with the expression people use when someone has said something both factually coherent and fundamentally missing the point, and she set the map back down and walked out without further comment. That was day 3 of what was supposed to be a 6-week secondment to Vardek Station. The station sat on the western rim of the Keth Plateau at approximately 3,400 meters elevation, on a wide basalt shelf that the wind came across from the north and the northwest, with a directness that made you respect the people who had picked the site. The Threll had established it 9 months earlier as part of a joint terrain mapping initiative. Humans were providing geological context and surface expertise for a region we had surveyed partially for 2 decades. The Threll were providing the survey technology that would compile everything into a comprehensive 3-dimensional model of the plateau and the valley below it. In practice, this meant 8 Threll specialists living in a pressurized habitat module that resembled a very large silver seed pod that had crash-landed on the basalt shelf and decided to stay. Plus me, Rail Austin, seconded from the Valin Province Survey Corps, sleeping in a secondary bay that had been added to the habitat as an afterthought and smelled faintly of the sealant compound they had used on the floor junction. I had been doing survey work for 21 years. Before the Threll secondment, there had been a 3-year posting with a commercial survey firm on the northern coast. Before that, 8 years with the Provincial Corps doing highland work. Before that, a 2-year stint as a junior surveyor in the Coast Range, learning the trade from a team lead named Das who had been at it for 30 years, and who had a compass that was older than I was, and who had once navigated a 6-person team through a 4-day whiteout in the eastern mountains using nothing but that compass and a paper map, and the patience of a man who had been in worse situations than this, and had always come out of them eventually. I was with that team. It is a memory I keep in a specific part of my mind, the part that does not second-guess things. The Keth Plateau was not the most demanding terrain I had worked. It was high, which meant the weather moved fast and the temperature dropped sharply after sunset, and it had a geological characteristic that nobody had fully cataloged yet, something about the mineral composition of the valley floor that amplified geomagnetic interference when the regional conditions were right, pushing interference spikes through the plateau 3 or 4 times per year at intensities that could affect digital systems. The survey authority had flagged this in the briefing notes. Weiss had noted it in the station's risk register as a Class 2 event probability. I had read both documents and packed accordingly. My kit was what it always was. 3 paper topographic maps of the Keth Plateau at different scales, 1 full plateau overview, 1 sector scale for the western work area, 1 detail scale for the ridgeline and col systems I would be walking. Printed on weatherproof laminate stock, the kind that functions in rain and snow and can be folded and unfolded 1,000 times without losing legibility. A compass, brass body, liquid-filled capsule, pivot needle, 40 years old. My first survey team lead, a woman named Orville, had given it to me at the end of my probationary period. She had a lot of things to say about survey work, but the thing she said about the compass was the shortest. It works when everything else doesn't. A field notebook, hardcover, waterproof pages, a clinometer for gradient measurement, a signal mirror, 120 meters of rope. A camp stove that ran on compressed gas canisters and had no electronic ignition, manual spark only, which is how I preferred it. The usual. The Threll had 16 active sensor arrays on the habitat roof. 2 autonomous survey drones with navigation, chips capable of resolving position to within 30 centimeters in any operational weather condition. A navigation AI with real-time satellite uplink and active terrain modeling that could update a route plan faster than a human could read one. Heated suits with integrated GPS, altitude sensors, and a 6-hour battery reserve on the navigation integration system alone. Boots with elevation feedback to within 8 centimeters. Communication gear that ran on 3 redundant frequencies. Their equipment occupied roughly 4 times the volume of everything I had brought. It weighed, by my estimate, somewhere in the range of 12 to 14 times as much. I am not in the ordinary run of things, someone who comments on these disparities unprompted. I have worked in enough environments where the most expensive gear failed first to have settled, long ago, into a position of general equanimity about what other people think is adequate methodology. The commentary began, as it often does in these situations, gently. Weiss was the station commander, and she had a manner I recognized, the dry, precise certainty of a senior specialist who has been good at her work for a long time and has calibrated her confidence accordingly. She was not contemptuous exactly. She was thorough. When she said my map looked archaeological, she said it with the careful flatness of someone who is making an accurate observation rather than an unkind one, and I believed she thought so. The survey technician named Orvith was less careful. Orvith was young for the Threll, angular and lean in the way their species runs, blue-gray skin over a frame that was half a head taller than mine, with the brass-colored eyes that all the Threll at Vardek had, and a way of moving around the station that suggested he had not yet fully mapped the gap between his knowledge and his experience. He was technically competent. I watched him operate the drone navigation suite on day 4, and he was fast, accurate, and methodical about the sequence checks. He was also the kind of person who, having been issued excellent tools, tends to define methodology by those tools rather than defining tools by the methodology they serve. He watched me unfold my topographic map at the start of day 4, spread it on the common table, orient it with the compass, and trace the route for my morning traverse. He stood in the doorway of the common bay for a moment with a mug of something warm. "You navigate with that," he said. "I do. On the terrain itself." "That's generally where navigation happens," I said. He looked at the map, then at the compass, then at me with the expression of a man who has encountered something he needs to analyze. Our drone navigation suite resolves position to 30 centimeters in any weather condition within operational parameters. Active terrain modeling updates every 11 seconds. It can recalculate a route in response to real-time obstacle changes. "Good system," I said. "Your map cannot update. It cannot recalculate. It cannot respond to terrain changes." "Right." He waited. He seemed to be expecting something further, some qualification I would offer, some context that would make the continued use of paper maps and a 40-year-old compass make sense to a person of reasonable intelligence. I did not have anything to add, so I folded the map to the panel I needed, pocketed the compass, and went out to start the traverse. I came back in the middle of the afternoon to find Orvith and the woman named Shevath and the broad, quiet specialist called Drayle gathered at the common table with my compass. They had taken it out of my kit. It had been sitting on my bunk shelf and were turning it in their hands, examining it. Drayle held it up to the window light. Shevath was reading the cardinal markings. "It points to magnetic north," Shevath said, sounding like a person working through the logic of something very simple that has somehow become surprising. "In general," I said from the doorway. The 3 of them looked up. There was a beat, the particular beat of people who have been discussing something in your absence and have not calculated the timing of your return well. Drayle set the compass down on the table. "No processor," he said. He seemed genuinely puzzled by this, in the way of a specialist who has spent a career working with active systems and is trying to locate the value proposition in a passive one. "How does it? It has no power source." "It's a needle in a liquid," I said. "The Earth's magnetic field moves the needle. No power required." "What about magnetic interference?" Shevath asked. "Significant magnetic interference will deflect it. That's a limitation worth knowing. In a moderate geomagnetic event, I'll correct for deviation. In a severe one, I navigate with terrain features and the map." "But you still use it," Orvith said from the corner, where he had apparently come in while I was at the doorway. He was watching the compass as though it were an exhibit. "I still use it," I said. I took the compass off the table, put it back in my kit, and went to get water. Behind me I heard the conversation resume, voices lower. I caught fragments. The Threll word for archaeological came through clearly. The phrase that means equipment from a prior era came through. The particular verbal construction that implies fond tolerance for something that has already been overtaken by progress came through. I drank my water and went back to work. Over the following 10 days, the commentary acquired texture. Orvith developed a running reference to my field notebook as the archive, which he deployed with the consistency of a person who has found a joke that works and sees no reason to retire it. It started on day 7 when I was updating my elevation sketches at the common table, and he came in from a drone survey, pulled off his outer layer, and looked over my shoulder at the page. "New entry for the archive," he said. "Elevation gradient on the north face of the secondary col," I said. "Steeper than the map shows at the upper third. Worth knowing before anyone tries to traverse it in poor visibility." "Our drone's LiDAR captured the same face at a resolution of 4 centimeters per data point," he said. "It updates automatically every survey pass." "Good," I said. "So when someone needs to traverse the north face of the secondary col in poor visibility without a working drone, they can look at my notebook." He looked at me for a moment, then he refilled his mug and left. Shevath asked me once, with what I think was genuine professional curiosity rather than mockery, she had a more careful quality than Orvith, whether Human Survey Corps budgets included provisions for technology refreshes. She phrased it in the way someone phrases a question when they have a point to make but prefer to let you arrive at it yourself. I told her our budget was modest, and our kit was chosen for conditions rather than specifications. She nodded, and then asked whether I thought the conditions we were operating in warranted more capable navigation tools, and I told her I thought the conditions warranted multiple capable navigation tools, and that I carried the ones I did because they functioned in the widest range of those conditions. She seemed to find this a less satisfying answer than she had expected. I let that be. Drayle, whom I had come to respect for the thoroughness of his work and the quiet precision he brought to every technical task, asked me one afternoon what I did when the weatherproof laminate on the map reached the end of its service life. I told him I ordered a new one from the depot. He nodded with the careful patience of someone confirming a workaround and then went back to his system's calibration. But I noticed he came back to the question 2 days later, in a different form. He asked how I kept the map current if the terrain changed between printings, and I explained the correction system the survey depot used, quarterly updates from the satellite archive, and the practice of annotating changes in field pencil on the laminate surface when you noticed them. He looked at the map and its pencil annotations. There were about a dozen by that point, mostly gradient corrections and one significant drainage channel deviation I had found on day 9, and he was quiet for a moment. "That is a manual update system," he said. "Yes," I said. "Dependent on individual observation." "Yes." "The drone's terrain model updates automatically based on every survey pass," he said. "No manual intervention required. Current within 11 seconds. 11 seconds is very good, I said. It is, he agreed, and went back to his calibration. The museum joke coalesced around day 12. I was not present for its first use, but I heard the word twice that afternoon in different conversations, once from Orvith in the corridor, and once from a technician called Vess, who I did not interact with much, and by the following morning it had established itself as a station reference. Orvith asked me at breakfast whether I was planning to donate the archive to the museum before I rotated out, and two of the others laughed, and Vyse, who had been reading something at the far end of the table, gave Orvith a brief, precise look that had enough weight to it to stop him adding anything further. He added nothing further. I ate my breakfast. I want to be precise about what I thought during those weeks, because I think it is sometimes misunderstood. I was not waiting for an opportunity. I was not storing up the commentary for a later moment of vindication. I was doing survey work. The work was the point. The compass and the maps were tools that let me do the work, and whether or not the Threll found them adequate was interesting as an observation about the Threll, but was not otherwise relevant to what I was doing. Here is what I will say about 21 years in this work. You spend a significant portion of that time in conditions where the most expensive tool in the kit is the one that fails first, and after enough of those conditions, you stop being surprised by it, and eventually you stop being amused by it, and after long enough, you arrive at a position of simple pragmatism. The tools that work are the tools that work, regardless of whether anyone thinks they should be adequate. The terrain does not operate on consensus. The terrain operates on physics. A needle in a fluid follows a magnetic field. A contour line represents a gradient. These things remain true in any weather condition, at any elevation, regardless of what the sky is doing. I also knew, from the briefing notes that I had read carefully before accepting the secondment, that the Keth Plateau had a geomagnetic interference history that ran 3 to 4 events per year, with occasional significant spikes. I had pulled the historical frequency data from the Survey Authority archive and cross-referenced it with the regional meteorological pattern. The last Class 3 event at this elevation had been 11 months before the station was established. A Class 4 event had been recorded 7 years prior to that, in a monitoring station 50 kilometers to the south. The historical record showed 2 Class 4 events in the past 20 years at comparable latitudes and elevations in this region. I noted the data, I packed the compass, I packed the paper maps. I did not say any of this to the Threll. The geomagnetic storm was flagged in the regional forecast at 60 hours out. The forecast put it at Class 2, within the station's certified operational parameters, which ran to Class 3. Vyse noted it in the morning briefing on day 19 as an expected event, operational impact minimal, no precautionary measures required beyond standard storm protocols. Orvith mentioned this to me that evening over dinner. He had a way of bringing information to me that had developed over the previous 2 weeks, a kind of patient explanation, as though he were briefing a colleague who was not yet fully up to speed on how things worked. I did not take it badly. He was not a bad person. He was a person who was very confident and had not yet been in a situation that gave him reason to revise that confidence. The station's sensor systems, he said, are certified to Class 3 geomagnetic interference, active compensation on all navigation chips, full orbital sync redundancy and magnetic field correction running in real time. He paused. Your compass has no compensation system, I said. It's a needle in a fluid. It's not hardened against anything because it has no active components for interference to affect. He turned this over for a moment. I could see him looking for the counter-argument and not finding quite the one he wanted. So in a geomagnetic event, he said, your compass still functions, but only because it does not function in any meaningful operational sense. I considered this formulation for a moment. It tells me which way is north, I said. It shows me where the ridgeline is relative to my position. It gives me the bearing from here to the eastern col. Combined with the paper map, it lets me navigate the terrain without any power source, without any satellite link, without any digital systems at all. To 30-meter accuracy, he said. To 30-meter accuracy, I agreed. He nodded, satisfied, as though I had just conceded the main point. I did not correct the framing. 30-meter accuracy was not a concession in any terrain where the relevant features were separated by hundreds of meters. A ridgeline is hard to miss at 30 meters. A drainage channel is hard to miss at 30 meters. The rock overhang I had noted on day 6 was approximately 8 meters long, but I did not expect to be navigating to within 8 meters. I expected to navigate to within 30 meters and then use my eyes, which is how you use a compass. But explaining this would have been explaining something he had not yet had reason to understand, and there is a particular inefficiency to explaining things people have not yet had reason to understand. The understanding, when it arrives, is more durable if it arrives from experience. I went to bed. I lay there for a while before sleeping, listening to the sensor arrays cycle on the roof. 16 systems, continuous scan. The faint high-frequency sound of technology doing exactly what it was designed to do. I fell asleep with that sound and with the wind and with the brass compass on the shelf above my bunk pointing north through the dark the way it always did. The storm hit at approximately 4 in the morning. I know the time because my watch is mechanical, automatic wind, no battery, no processor, fully self-contained, and it read 4:07 when the first significant event woke me. I know it was a Class 4 and not a Class 2 because when I got up and looked out the habitat port, the sky above the Keth Plateau was doing what I had seen it do twice before in hard geomagnetic events at altitude. A luminescence in the cloud cover that was not quite auroral and not quite electrical, a green-white cast to the darkness. A quality of charged stillness in the air that I have never found a way to describe accurately, except to say that it feels like the atmosphere is concentrating on something other than weather. The sensor arrays on the habitat roof had stopped making sound. They were normally audible at night, a faint high-frequency cycling, the sound of 16 active systems running their continuous scans. That sound was gone. In its place was the wind, which was from the northwest at somewhere between 35 and 40 kilometers per hour, and the creak of the habitat structure taking the pressure, and silence where the technology had been. I got dressed. I put on all my layers in the correct order, which takes longer than people who don't work in cold environments usually expect. Base layer, mid-weight insulation hard shell, wool socks, then the liner socks, then the boot socks. Boots laced properly, not quickly. I made tea on the camp stove, compressed gas, manual spark ignition, completely unaffected by what was happening outside, and sat on my bunk with the field notebook and went through my notes on the eastern sector while the tea cooled to drinkable. At 5:30, Vise came into the secondary bay. She was wearing her suit. The indicator lights on the suit's wrist integration panel were dark, navigation, GPS, altitude feedback all down. She had the suit's thermal layer running on passive, which was keeping her warm, which was what mattered. She looked at the camp stove. She looked at the tea. She stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was the expression of a person who is, in the early stages of understanding a situation they had not considered. The navigation AI has lost satellite link, she said. Geomagnetic interference will do that, I said. The orbital sync needs a clean signal path. The sensor arrays are offline. The drones are grounded, navigation chips are locked by the interference. The suit integrations are down. She paused, making a list in her head. The station thermal systems are functioning. The habitat is secure. The power is unaffected, but we have no active navigation capability. What class is it? I asked. Class 4, she said. I nodded. Class 4 was outside the certified operational parameters. Class 3 certification had seemed adequate for a forecast that called a Class 2 event. The storm duration, I asked. Unknown. The meteorological uplink is down. These typically run 12 to 20 hours at this latitude and elevation, I said. Peaking in the first third, clearing in the final third. You're looking at 8 to 10 more hours of full interference, then a gradual return to operational systems. She absorbed this. Then, Orvith's survey team. She said it in the flat tone of a person stating a fact they would prefer to be a different fact. They went out at 3:30 for a pre-dawn elevation run on the eastern call. Pre-dawn traverses have been routine. The AI guidance makes it straightforward in the dark. They were scheduled back at 5. I looked at the window. The light outside was wrong, the greenish interference glow rather than pre-dawn darkness, but it was brightening. They're not back. No. 3 people. Orvith, Shevath, and Mavith. I set down the tea. What was their last known position? Vise had been foresighted. She had a physical printout from the navigation AI, the last position frame it had managed before the link dropped, timestamped at 4:16. She held it out. The position marker showed them approximately 2 kilometers from the station, on the ridgeline approach to the eastern call. The timestamp meant they had been at that position before the interference peak, which meant they had potentially continued moving during the onset, which meant they could be anywhere between 2 and 4 kilometers out, depending on how far they got before the navigation lock failed and prudence told them to stop. I put the printout next to my topographic map on the bunk shelf and looked at both. When their navigation systems failed, I said, standard procedure for a disoriented team in terrain they don't know physically is to find elevation, find cover, and hold position. They wouldn't have tried to navigate back without functional guidance. That's how people get hurt. Yes, V said, they would have stopped. So they're in a static position somewhere in this range. I put my finger on the map. The area I was indicating covered roughly 2 square kilometers of the ridgeline zone between the station and the eastern call. The terrain in this sector has 3 viable shelter positions. The most sheltered, with the best field of view down the drainage channel and the best protection from northwest wind, is here. I pointed. Rock overhang on the northeast face of a basalt outcrop, about 8 meters long. I walked past it on day 6. Vise looked at where my finger was. She looked at the map. She looked at the printout. She looked at me. You can navigate to that position, she said. The phrasing was halfway between a question and a statement. It was the phrasing of a person asking a question they believe they already know the answer to, but need to confirm before proceeding. I can navigate to that position, I said. The silence in the secondary bay was brief, but it had content. Outside, the wind moved against the habitat structure with a steady pressure. The sensor arrays made no sound. Our operational emergency protocols, Vise said carefully, require that recovery traverses in zero navigation conditions be conducted using certified methodology by qualified personnel. She looked at the compass on my bunk shelf. Analog navigation methodology is not currently listed in our certified methodology register. I waited. I am authorizing a supplementary methodology addition, she said. Category designation, legacy analog navigation, effective immediately for the duration of this event. She was saying it the way you say something when you are simultaneously composing the written record and speaking aloud. I am requesting that you lead the recovery traverse. All right, I said. I want 2 people who can move at field pace in this weather. The thermal layers on the suits are passive functional. Yes, thermal protection is intact. Then the suits are fine. The navigation problem is mine to handle. She brought Drail and Issen, the emergency systems specialist, who was quiet and deliberate and had never participated in any of the museum commentary, which I had noticed. They were suited and waiting at the habitat door in 10 minutes. I took 4 more to finish layering up properly. Check my pack. verify my map fold, and put the compass in my chest pocket where it lived when I was working. Vise watched the compass go into my pocket. I cannot say with certainty what her expression conveyed at that moment, but the quality of the watching had changed from what it had been for the previous 3 weeks. I opened the door and we went out into it. The plateau under Class 4 interference at pre-dawn is a specific kind of experience. The light was that green-white luminescence, not enough to see fine detail, but enough to see the ground and the ridgeline and the major terrain features. The wind from the northwest was steady and had some force to it, cold, sharp, the kind of wind that gets through insulation seams if you let it find one. The sensor arrays on the habitat roof were visible from outside as dark shapes, their active status lights completely off, their housings doing nothing. I noted this and moved on. I shot the first bearing from outside the habitat door. The compass settled in about 2 seconds. There was some deviation from the interference, small, within the correction range I knew from the calibration check I had done on day 1. I applied the correction, confirmed my bearing to the eastern ridgeline, and started walking. Vise took my left shoulder. Drayle and Issen came behind in the close follow spacing that is correct for poor visibility traverse in unfamiliar terrain, close enough to maintain visual contact, spread enough to not create a tripping hazard. Nobody spoke. The wind made conversation difficult, and there was nothing that needed saying. I walked the terrain the way you walk terrain you know physically, which is to say I was not just following a bearing. I was following the bearing and watching the surface and feeling the gradient under my boots and comparing all of it against what the map said it should be doing. This is the part of the work that you cannot teach from documentation. You can describe it, and I have tried to, but the description is not the thing. The thing is a mode of attention built over years, where the landscape and the map and the compass are in simultaneous conversation, and you are following that conversation rather than making separate calculations. The drainage channel that the map showed running south from the ridgeline saddle appeared at roughly the distance the map predicted, cutting a pale line through the dark basalt. I crossed it at the shallow point I had identified on day 9, not the most obvious crossing, which was wider and faster, but the one with firm footing on both banks. In wet conditions after a storm, the obvious crossing would be slippery. The correct one was 30 meters east. You find these things by walking the ground. The AI's terrain model had the drainage channel in its data with 4-centimeter resolution. What it didn't have was the knowledge of what the footing felt like in storm-wet conditions, because no one had been there in storm-wet conditions to walk it. The saddle itself came up correctly. The secondary ridgeline crossing I had planned was at the lower saddle I had identified on my day 5 traverse, not the obvious line, which was more direct but more exposed, but the terrain-correct one. Lower, sheltered from the northwest wind by the basalt ridge above it, solid footing all the way. We crossed at the saddle. The wind dropped on the lee side, a predictable effect of the ridgeline geometry. I heard Vise take a single long breath in the relative quiet of the lee. I did not remark on it. At roughly 2 kilometers from the station, Drayle spoke for the first time since we had left. He had been watching me work, watching the compass, watching my eyes on the terrain, watching the map I consulted briefly every few hundred meters. How are you determining the route, precisely? Terrain features cross-referenced against the map, I said. The drainage channel running direction, the ridgeline profile, the slope gradient on this face. I walked this sector on day 5, so I have ground truth for the major landmarks. The compass gives me directional reference when the terrain is ambiguous, flat ground, low visibility, high ground where features are less defined. And if you hadn't walked it on day 5, I would navigate more slowly and check more frequently against the map. It would take longer. We would still get there. He was quiet for a moment. Then, our navigation AI processes 17 input sources simultaneously. Real-time orbital positioning, active terrain radar, inertial measurement, atmospheric sensors. I know, I said. It's a very good system. And yet, he said, the same two words Weiss had used, unfinished, for the same reason. I did not complete the sentence for him. The sentence completed itself, out there in the interference-lit dark on the lee side of the ridgeline. We walked. At about 300 meters from the estimated overhang position, I slowed and read the terrain more carefully. The interference had dropped slightly, still class 4, still enough to lock the AI chips, but reduced from the peak intensity, and in the slightly improved visibility I could pick out the basalt outcrop I was looking for against the dark bulk of the ridge. A specific formation, flat-faced, northeast-facing, with the characteristic overhang created when the softer layer below eroded faster than the cap. I had walked past it on day 6 on a routine sector traverse. I had noted it in the field notebook. Rock overhang, northeast face, basalt outcrop approx. 8 m horizontal span, sheltered from NW, good sight line down drainage. Possible emergency shelter. Not because I expected to need it, because that is what you note. You note the terrain because you are in the terrain and the terrain is the job, and you never know in advance which note you will need. The overhang appeared at 360 meters from where I had estimated it, on a bearing of 73 degrees east-northeast, exactly as I had noted it in the field notebook on day 6. Under it, sitting with their backs against the rock and their knees drawn up in the heat conservation posture that is instinctive in cold environments, were Orvith, Shevath, and Mavith. Orvith looked up first. His brass-colored eyes moved across Weiss, across Drail, across Issen, and settled on me. His expression was steady. Threll composure in adverse conditions is genuine, not performed, but I recognized the quality of his stillness. I had found people in terrain before. The stillness has a specific character. It is the stillness of a person who has been managing their situation carefully and is now, with great relief, prepared to hand it to someone else. His eyes dropped from my face to the compass in my hand. He looked at it for a long moment. "You navigated here," he said, not with the tone he had used in the station, with a different tone, the tone of a man who is making an accurate observation and is aware that it carries more weight than it might have carried 3 weeks ago. "Bearing and terrain features," I said, "not complicated once you know the ground." "I know the coordinates of this position," he said slowly. "I ran surveys here on days 9 and 11. I have high-precision positioning data for every feature in this sector." He paused. "I don't know the terrain." "That's the difference," I said. No emphasis, no edge. It was simply true, and we both knew it, and pointing at it with anything more than a statement of fact would have added nothing. I gave all 3 of them water from my pack. I always carry significantly more than my own requirement, which is a habit from a cold weather search and rescue course I took in my 8th year of survey work, and did a quick assessment. No injuries, cold but functional, suits working correctly on passive thermal. Shevath had a bruised hand from gripping a rock edge during a wind gust on the descent. Mavith, the quiet one, looked at the compass in my hand for a long moment, and then looked up at the interference-lit sky with an expression I did not analyze. "Ready to move," I said. We started back. I took a slightly different return route, added 400 meters along the drainage channel before the second ridgeline crossing, because the wind had shifted about 15 degrees since we had come out, and the crossing point I had used on the way in would now be more exposed than I wanted. Weiss noticed the deviation from our inbound bearing. She said nothing. That kind of trust, the trust that expresses itself by not asking a question, is something that develops quickly in terrain when you have just been found by someone using a compass. The return traverse took 1 hour and 26 minutes. We came back through the habitat door into warmth and light. And Weiss stood for a moment in the operations bay, looking at the dark navigation console, before she turned around. "When did you last use this methodology for a live recovery operation?" 2 years ago, I said. East Highland Survey. Solar event caused a satellite blackout that lasted 31 hours. 3 people out of a river valley. Before that, 5 years prior in the Coast Range, fog event, 47 hours, calms down, navigated a team of 4 across a ridgeline system in 0 visibility. How often are you in conditions where your active navigation is unavailable? I thought about it, often enough that I have never considered leaving the paper maps and compass behind. She absorbed this. The station's emergency protocols, she said, do not include provision for analog navigation methodology. This is a significant gap. She said it with the precision of a station commander preparing a report, not with apology or defensiveness. I will be addressing it. It's a common gap, I said. Most stations above 3,000 meters have the same one. High-altitude terrain amplifies geomagnetic events. That's known. The kit provision hasn't followed the risk profile. No, she said, it has not. Orvith was at the edge of the common bay. He had taken off his outer layer and was holding a warm mug with both hands and looking at the floor with the focused inward expression of a man running a specific memory through several iterations and extracting information from each one. I went to my bunk. I unlaced my boots in the correct order, which takes longer than people expect. I took the compass out of my chest pocket and set it on the bunk shelf, where it had sat every night for 3 weeks, pointing north. It sat there and pointed north the way it had pointed north through the transit on the way to Vardek, through 21 years of survey work, through conditions in 3 mountain ranges and 2 coastal survey zones that had each, at some point, provided a moment where a needle in a fluid was the only navigation I had. The storm ran for another 16 hours. I made tea 3 more times. I updated my field notebook with the terrain observations from the recovery traverse slope gradient data, vegetation pattern at the ridgeline crossing, the precise location of the rock overhang with the drainage channel bearing I had used to find it. I slept for 4 hours in the afternoon. The skill of sleeping when you can being one of the things the long-duration survey work teaches you without you noticing it is teaching you. The Threll worked through the down systems carefully and without panic, checked physical systems, managed battery draws, kept the habitat secure. They were competent at this. Weiss ran the manual operations with the same tight precision she brought to everything else, which I had expected. Drayle turned out to have a very good practical grasp of habitat systems in manual mode, and spent most of the storm in the technical bay doing things I didn't fully understand, but which resulted in the habitat remaining warm and the lights remaining on. Weiss spent several hours at a physical drafting table in the operations bay, writing. A person at a drafting table during a communications blackout, writing steadily and with evident precision, is writing something that will matter when the systems come back. I did not ask what it was. Orvith was in the common bay for much of the storm's duration. I passed through a few times for water, and he was each time in roughly the same position, sitting at the common table with a mug, looking at the middle distance with the focused inward expression of a man running a specific sequence through his mind, and finding it instructive. I did not speak to him. He did not speak to me. There are conversations that don't need to happen out loud because they have already happened on a ridgeline in a Class 4 event, when a man looks at a compass in someone else's hand and says, I know the coordinates. I don't know the terrain. Shevath came and sat at the frame of my bunk bay sometime in the second afternoon of the storm. She was a deliberate person, as I had come to understand. She did not come to conversations without knowing what she wanted to say. She sat and looked at the compass on the shelf for a moment. When you were looking for us, she said, before you left, did you know where we would be? I had a well-reasoned guess, I said. The terrain made the overhang the most likely shelter position for a team that had lost navigation on the Eastern Col approach. You would have done what trained people do, which is find elevation and cover and hold position. I knew the overhang was there because I had walked past it on day 6 and recorded it. We did exactly that, she said. Found the highest ground we could safely reach before the peak interference hit. Found the overhang by visual when we were already nearly at it. We could see it from about 30 meters in the interference light. Stayed there. She paused. We had no way to tell anyone where we were. You made the right call, I said. Orvith knew he had survey data for that position. He kept saying the coordinates. He said them several times. She looked at the compass on the shelf. He knows those coordinates to 4 decimal places. Yes, I said. It did him no good. No, I said. Coordinates without navigation are a different kind of information. She was quiet for a while. Outside, the storm moved against the habitat roof with a steady low pressure. The sensor arrays made no sound, still locked, the interference still running at near-peak intensity. He's not a bad surveyor, she said. This did not seem to be a defense of Orvith but a clarification of her own thinking. He's meticulous. His data is precise. His drone operation is the best on the team. I know, I said. I watched him work. What he doesn't have, she said carefully, is the habit of knowing the ground. He surveys the ground. He doesn't move through it the way you move through it. That's the gap, I said. It seems like a large gap, given where we were tonight. It's a gap most people in high-precision survey work have, I said. The technology is excellent. It covers the gap completely under normal conditions. The gap only appears at the edge. She nodded slowly. The Threll nod measured, once, complete acknowledgement. I'm going to learn to use a compass, she said. Not with the tone of a resolution, but with the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a person who has added something to a list and crossed something else off it. It takes an hour to get the basics, I said. Give it a few practice traverses and you'll have it. She looked at the compass for another moment. Then she stood and walked to the doorway and stopped. The museum piece, she said. That's what Orvith called it, I said. She stood there a moment longer. For what it's worth, she said, I didn't use that word. I know, I said, that was Orvith. She left. The storm cleared fully about 19 hours after it had peaked. The sensor arrays came back online in sequence. I could follow the progression from my bunk, the high-frequency cycling resuming array by array as the interference fell below the operational threshold. The navigation AI went through its reinitialization process, which I could hear as a series of status tones from the operations bay. The satellite link reestablished. All 17 input sources came back online. Orvith was at the navigation console when the AI completed its boot sequence. I could see him from the secondary bay doorway. He stood there looking at the active display for a long moment with his hands flat on the console edge. He did not say anything. In the context of the previous 3 weeks, the silence had a particular texture. Weiss came to the secondary bay 40 minutes later. I am filing an incident report, she said. The recovery traverse will be documented as a successful navigation event in a Class 4 geomagnetic event using legacy analog navigation methodology, resulting in the location and safe return of 3 station personnel. All right, I said. I'm also filing a gap report recommending mandatory analog navigation equipment for all joint human Threll survey stations operating above 3,000 meters elevation. She was precise about this. It had been composed. The recommended kit list is paper topographic maps at 3 scales on weatherproof stock, a liquid-filled magnetic compass, a field notebook, and a clinometer. I have included the specific equipment specifications from your kit in the appendix. Standard survey depot items, I said, nothing specialized. The gap report will also recommend, she said, a mandatory familiarization protocol, every station crew member to achieve basic analog navigation competency within 60 days of assignment. 2 sessions with a qualified navigator. She paused. I am requesting that you develop the curriculum and deliver the first sessions before you rotate out. I can do that, I said. She nodded, then, There is a second report. The methodology designation, Legacy Analog Navigation. I am recommending to the Joint Survey Authority that it be changed. I looked at her. The word legacy, she said, implies something that has been superseded and is retained only for historical or transitional reasons. This is not accurate. The methodology was not superseded in a Class 4 event. It was the only functioning navigation methodology present. She said it clinically, as she said everything, but there was a precision to the word choice that was not merely clinical. I am recommending the designation, Resilient Analog Navigation. I did not say anything for a moment. That's a better word, I said. She held out her hand, the Threll gesture, fingertips forward, formal acknowledgement. I put my hand against hers. What category does the gap report go under? I asked. She looked at me. A brief pause, very brief, but there was something in the quality of the briefness. Critical equipment deficiency, she said. Category 1. Not archaeological, I said. The stillness that followed was the closest Weiss came, in 6 weeks at Vardek Station, to something that could be called humor. Her expression did not change. But the quality of the stillness, the way it held for exactly 1 beat longer than a purely professional exchange would require, told me that she had received the observation, considered it, and found it, on balance, accurate. No, she said, not archaeological. She turned back to her console. The last 4 weeks of the secondment ran without significant incident. The sensor arrays performed its specification. The navigation AI processed terrain data at rates that were, by any objective measure, remarkable. Orvith's survey work was thorough and technically precise, as it had always been, and he covered ground faster than I could, and produced datasets more detailed than anything I could generate in a lifetime of paper map traversals. I want to be precise about this. The Threll technology was not deficient. It was excellent. A Class 4 geomagnetic event at this elevation is an extreme condition. The fact that their equipment failed under extreme conditions does not make it inadequate under normal ones. It makes it inadequate under extreme ones, which is a different and more specific finding. What I had was not better. It was resilient in a different direction. It traded precision for robustness. It traded update frequency for independence from infrastructure. It had costs. The costs were known and acceptable for the conditions I worked in. The question was never whether analog navigation was better than digital. The question was always whether you had any navigation at all when the digital stopped. This is the thing that tends to be left out of the conversations people have about technology and methodology. The comparison is always made at optimal conditions. Nobody compares tools at the edge, and the edge is exactly where you discover which tools are load-bearing. On the morning of the 3rd week after the storm, Orvith knocked on my bunk bay door. "Would you show me how to shoot a bearing?" he said. No preamble, no setup, no reference to anything that had come before. Just the question, in the same neutral tone he might have used to ask about a survey calibration procedure. I showed him. He was precise about it. Threll precision in learning new things is full attention. Every step done correctly or repeated until it is. No skipped stages. No assumption that understanding the principle is equivalent to having the skill. By the end of the first session, he had the mechanics. By the end of the second, he could shoot a reliable bearing, maintain it across a traverse, and check his position against the paper map with an error he measured and recorded. He described this position accuracy, with a notable absence of irony, as adequate for navigating the call approach in a Class 4 event. He also asked at the end of the second session whether I would walk him through the method I used to identify viable emergency shelter positions during a routine traverse. I told him what to look for: formation type, exposure orientation, sight lines, drainage. He wrote it in his field notebook, which he had started carrying in the 2nd week after the storm, which he had not had before. I showed Shevath over 3 sessions. She had a natural terrain instinct that I do not think came from training, but from the way her mind worked. She read the map the way surveyors read it, as a representation of how water and gravity and rock work together across time, rather than as a set of coordinate spaces to navigate between. She was better than Orvith at the map reading by the end of the first session, and not far behind him on the compass work by the end of the third. And she said, in the same flat matter-of-fact tone she had used when she said she was going to learn the compass, that she was going to maintain the practice and find an opportunity to do a solo sector traverse before the next crew rotation. I told her a solo sector traverse would take most of a day if she was doing it properly. She said she understood that. I believed her. Drayle asked for one session near the end. He was not naturally a terrain reader. He was a systems person, and the map initially read to him as a set of symbols to be decoded rather than a representation of physical reality to be understood. But he was systematic and patient, and by the end of the session he had the bearing mechanics correctly and a working understanding of the contour system. He would need practice. He knew it and said so. Maveth never asked for a session. On my last morning at Vardic Station, packing my kit to catch the transport down to Valin Province, I found my clinometer cleaned and its pivot calibrated with a precision that mine had not had when I arrived at the station. Not by me. I did not ask who had done it. I had been watching who paid close attention during the sessions I ran for the others. Maveth had been in the common bay for all of them, apparently occupied with something else. I had noticed that she was never quite as occupied as she appeared to be. Weiss signed off on my secondment report in the operations bay. The sensor arrays all green. The navigation AI running its continuous 17-source position feed, an active terrain model. The station fully operational in clear plateau air that smelled of basalt and altitude, and the particular cleanness of high-elevation mornings after a storm has passed through. She handed me the physical copy of the report. She did not need to print one, it would be filed electronically. She had printed one, I noticed. The protocol update has been accepted by the Joint Survey Authority, she said. Mandatory implementation for all qualifying stations within the next operational cycle. Analog navigation kit and crew familiarization. How many stations? I asked. 47 at current count in the joint registry above 3,000 meters. The compass order has already been placed. A pause. 47 liquid-filled magnetic compasses from a Valin Province survey depot, standard grade. Same as mine, I said. Same as yours. She held out her hand in the Threll formal gesture. I put mine against it. Rail Austin, Survey Corps Valin Province. Weiss, Subcommander, Threll Terrain Survey Authority. She did not add anything further. I had not expected her to. She turned back to her console and the 17 active input sources and the real-time terrain model that was, now that the sky was clear, updating with its usual 11-second currency. I walked out of Vardic Station into clear plateau air at 3,400 meters, slung my pack, and started down the trail to the pickup point. The compass was in my chest pocket, the needle found north and held. 3 weeks later, a copy of the incident report arrived in my Survey Corps inbox. It was thorough and accurate, and I had no complaints about it. The recovery traverse was documented correctly, bearing taken, terrain followed, position estimated from prior field observation, team located, return to station. The gap report was attached and had been approved by the Joint Authority with a note indicating expedited review given the Category 1 classification. The methodology designation appeared in the new Joint Protocol Register, as Weiss had written it. Resilient Analog Navigation. Category 1 Essential Equipment. Mandatory provision for all joint survey stations operating above 3,000 meters elevation, or in regions with documented geomagnetic interference history above Class 2 frequency. 47 stations, 47 compasses. I thought about my team lead Orville, who had given me mine at the end of my probationary period and said, It works when everything else doesn't. She had been 61 years in the survey work by then, and she had said it without drama, the way you say something that is simply true and requires no ornamentation. At the bottom of the incident report, there was a summary field that asked for the classification of incident by contributing factor. 5 words. Weiss had filled it in herself. I could tell because the syntax was hers, precise, unornamented, technically accurate, without a word wasted and without any apparent awareness that it might read as a dry joke, which is the best kind of dry joke there is. The 5 words were, equipment failure, digital systems only. I filed the report in the active drawer. I made tea.